Hi Year 9, the first two slides you should already have done with the teacher during the lesson, so skip through slides 1 and 2 on this YouTube recording. So, our ambition today is to make sure that we know why the League of Nations failed. Over the last couple of lessons, we've been looking at incidents in both Manchuria and Abyssinia. So what we're going to hopefully be able to do by the end of today is make a reasoned judgment about the most important reason or reasons for the failure of the League. We're going to be having a look at the strengths, the weaknesses, and be able to see that there's actually multiple reasons for why the League of Nations failed. So the first action that we want you to take today is to note down the most important things from this slide. This is all about the impact of the Abyssinian and Manchurian crises on the reputation of the League of Nations. So feel free to pause this slide as much as you need to make sure that you have the main ideas about why it was that the League of Nations failed due to those two incidents. So if we have a little chat about it together, it says, it is important, the effect the two crises had on the League, as it is, the story of the events themselves. So you need to know about what happened, the dates of how it all happened, but the impact is absolutely crucial. So what those two crises revealed was that if a strong nation was prepared to ignore the League, just like Japan did and just like Italy did, the League could do very little about it. Both of those incidents, and in particular the Manchurian crisis, showed delay and slowness, made it look weak and made it look scared. This was not a good look for the League of Nations. Also, sanctions were shown to be weak and ineffective. Think back to Manchuria, the only sanctions they actually used were moral sanctions. And when they did try economic sanctions in the Abyssinian crisis, because of the Great Depression and lack of commitment, they didn't work anybody. Everybody by this point realised that Britain and France, they weren't really committed to the League. They were not prepared to use their armed forces in order to support and uphold the reputation of the League of Nations. By the end of 1936, Japan, Italy, and Britain and France had all betrayed the League of Nations. Japan and Italy by breaking the rules and then leaving, and Britain and France by not supporting the League of Nations and giving it what it needed. Smaller nations soon realised that the League was not the thing that was going to protect them. They stopped going to it for help. It meant that by the end of 1936 and into 1937, Britain and France themselves had lost complete faith in the League of Nations, and it wasn't going to stop war, as they moved towards this policy of appeasement. And appeasement was where they gave in to the reasonable demands of other countries. So, for example, Hitler at this period was starting to rebuild his army, to try and take over other countries. And Britain and France, rather than stopping him, decided to let him have whatever they felt was reasonable. So your first job, please, Year 9, is make some very quick bullet-pointed notes under the title Impact of the Abyssinian and Manchurian Crises. So your second job today, and again, pause this after I talked you through it, is to have a go at writing a quick paragraph. And this is just a judgment from you. There is no right or wrong answer to this. What I'd like you to do is give your justification. I want you to tell me which you think was more responsible for the League of Nations going wrong and failing. Was it the League's response to the Manchurian crisis, or was it the response to the Abyssinian crisis? So you'll need to look at your notes from the last two lessons. What happened in the Manchurian crisis, and why was that so damaging to the League? What happened in the Abyssinian crisis, and why was that so damaging to the League? So compare and contrast them, and just one short paragraph saying, I think it was the Abyssinian crisis because, or I think it was the Manchurian crisis because. You might need to consider what the League's actions actually were, what kind of sanctions they used, and what it was that the main countries within the League of Nations actually did. Was it the Manchurian crisis because it was the first time that the League had really been challenged since the Great Depression? Was it the Abyssinian crisis because of the betrayal of Britain and France and them failing to close the Suez Canal and not even really trying to stop Mussolini? Make a decision and then write a short paragraph with your view, please, Year 9. So we've now had a look at the two main short-term reasons for the failure of the League of Nations, what happened in Manchuria and what happened in Abyssinia. Both of those totally undermined the League. They showed the lack of commitment of the major countries. What we're now going to do is going to have a look at short and long-term reasons. So we're going to go back as well to the structure, the organisation, the membership, all of those early things that we looked at a few weeks ago before Christmas, and decide what really was it that killed off and finished the League of Nations. So on the last slide, I gave you some hints as to some of the main strengths, or certainly some of the main weaknesses of the League of Nations. Try and have a little think and pause this for a moment and think about, well, what was good about the League of Nations? Consider its aims. Maybe consider something about membership that was good. Maybe think about those other works that it did. And then have a think about the weaknesses. Think about the assembly, the council, the membership, the structure, how it dealt with crises, and some of that could be good or bad. So have a little think about what it was that was good and bad about the League before you move on, please, Year 9. So your next job is to make a little bit of a record of, well, what were the League strengths? And there were plenty of them. So in a moment, I want you to pause this slide and just make your own simple copy of the table. There actually isn't that much text in there. So the first strength, well, there was a commitment from lots of countries to world peace. The League over time did grow in size, those 42 countries to start with, and by 1929, around 60 nations were a member of the League. That was a real positive. At last, an organisation had been established to keep world peace. That had never happened before, and it was able to keep the peace in places like the Åland Islands, and this was a real positive. On top of that, the League over time lost its reputation as being seen as a winners' club, one that didn't allow countries who were seen to have done wrong in the past to join. But in 1926, Germany was able to join. Special departments of the League of Nations was a particular triumph for the League of Nations, improving living and working conditions for millions of people all over the world, banning lead in white paint, which was something that poisoned people all over the world, those kind of things, allowing people to, at this point, free themselves of slavery. They worked on diseases such as leprosy. It really was a good organisation for that. The League did achieve some successes on disarmament as well. There were at least some conferences being held and conversations being had. So just take a minute or two now and jot down those key strengths with an example. This time we've got the League weaknesses. On the left-hand side, we've got the actual weakness and an example on the right. So one of the main weaknesses, and we looked at this way back in about October time, the USA never joined the League of Nations. What that meant was that the League was never fully credible as an organisation. People didn't respect it as much. The world's most powerful nation was not a member. It meant that economic sanctions would never really work because countries could still trade with America. The League also didn't always want to enforce the Covenant rules. They didn't always want to use their sanctions. And of course, what that did was that again undermined the League, and it made it look as if it was letting some countries getting away with things. So the League made Greece, a weak country, pay damages to Bulgaria when they invaded Bulgarian territory. Well, that looked okay because the Greeks were in the wrong. But when Italy bombarded Greece, it was the Greeks were left as the victims, and the League didn't help them at all. So it seemed as if they were going to help the strong countries like Italy and punish weaker countries like Greece when they stepped out of line. This was not a good example for the League to be setting. It wasn't seen as a peacekeeping organisation by some. Some of it saw it as a club for those who had won the war. That was never going to mean that they were going to work well with each other. Germany weren't allowed to initially join the League of Nations in 1920. One of the real problems of the League of Nations was it never had an army. That meant it relied on other countries such as Britain and France donating or lending out their army, which they were quite unwilling to do. Disarmament was one of the key aims of the League of Nations, but lots and lots of countries were not really that keen on agreeing, and even when they did, they never actually put discussions into action, and the League never actually accomplished disarmament. A major problem was that Britain and France had a really bad experience in World War One, and they were really keen to avoid conflict. That meant they never really gave their full commitment to the League of Nations. And therefore, countries like France used it to enforce the Treaty of Versailles rather than to actually keep world peace. So pause this video again, please, and have a go at jotting down some of those key ideas. This is the bit we're going to come back together as a class, and I want you to give me some answers in your Q&A box. If you finish a little bit early, because we're going to come back together with 10 minutes left of the lesson, I want you to tell me what you think are the two most important reasons for the failure of the League. Was it that America were never there? Was it to do with Britain and France's commitment? Or was it some of those other things in the box we've just looked at? Was it the fact that they were a winners' club? There's lots and lots of reasons why the League of Nations failed. I want you to have a think about it, jot it down in your exercise book, and then I want you to put your view in the Q&A box so we can talk about it as a class. Our final question for the consideration today is, was the League more weak or more strong? Did the weaknesses of the League outweigh its strengths? Well, obviously it had some really key strengths, but it did have some fundamental weaknesses as well. What I want you to do is just jot down your answer to that in your exercise book and be ready to pop it in the Q&A box as well, so we can have a discussion at the end of the lesson. Thanks ever so much for your time today. We'll see you soon.